I titled this message, God is in Your Storm. We can take a lesson from Noah and the ark. As we go through this message today, you may hear those words and think of them, that for Noah, he had another problem. You see, the woodpeckers inside the boat may have been a greater problem than the storm outside. Sometimes those little woodpeckers are inside of us, and they become a greater annoyance than the things going on outside in the world around us. Even for Moses, remember that as he went to free the slaves, thousands of individuals were going to be freed. But when God told him what he was going to do, his reply was, "But God, who am I to appear before Pharaoh? Who am I to lead the people of Israel out of Egypt?" God's reply was, "I will certainly be with you." What he was telling Moses was that, you see, Moses, don't fear. You're with me. You're with me. Remember those words. That's what mattered. It was the words of the Hebrews that said, "I'll never leave you or forsake you." He was telling Moses that I'm not going to leave you. I'm not going to forsake you because you're with me. You're following me. It was not the task that God was asking Moses to do, but rather it was the importance of being with him, being around him. After all, if God could talk to a donkey and have that donkey speak to Balaam, why can't he talk to us? What was so ironic in that conversation, though, was that Balaam was actually talking to the donkey. And his words were so marvelous. His first words to the donkey was, "You've made me a fool. If I had a sword, I'd kill you." Now, wait a minute. You got a donkey that's talking. Who's the bigger of the fool? The donkey talking or the one talking to the donkey? You'd be thinking, the donkey's probably thinking, this man's lost his marbles. Well, you might have. But if God can make a donkey talk, he can certainly talk to us. It's like the elderly man that went fishing. He sat down beside the lake and was fishing, being very patient, and all of a sudden he heard a frog talking to him. The frog looked up at him and said, "Sir, if you'll pick me up and kiss me, I will turn into a beautiful princess and become your wife." The man didn't say anything. The frog said, "Sir, if you pick me up and kiss me, I'll turn into a beautiful princess and be your wife." The man thought for a minute, looked down at the frog, and reached down and picked up the frog, stuck it in his pocket, and started down the road towards home. And the frog said, "Sir, wait a minute. Didn't you hear me? I said, if you kiss me, I'll turn into a beautiful princess and be your wife." The man opened up his pocket, looked in, and said, "At this age, I'd rather have a talking frog." Well, Moses had to grasp what God was telling him. Telling him that what you're about to do is with me. You see, God could have done it himself. God can do a lot of things himself, but he's not going to do it without you. He's not going to do it without your assistance and your willingness to go with him, your willingness to be part of that. He needs you to be with the Father and to follow his lead. The job that God asks us to do matters, but it's more important to follow Christ's example, to be part of what he's doing, to be part of that ministry, to do what he needs us. Today I would ask what God would probably ask you. Do you love the unlovely, or do you only love those that are lovely? Do you go to McDonald's to buy a meal for that one that's pushing a shopping cart down the street, digging through the trash cans looking for food? Have you ever done that before? I've done that before, driving down Wanamaker and seen someone pushing a shopping cart full of junk, digging in a trash can, looking for food, looking for things. I made a circle and went back to McDonald's and bought food and brought it back and gave it to them. Or somebody's wounded and hurting. Do you just send them to Walgreens to get a Band-Aid? I could tell you a story about driving around Indianapolis, Indiana for 2 hours with a cloth wrapped around my finger and it was bleeding all over the place. And a couple ladies that thought they were nurses thought I needed to go to a hospital to have stitches and be cared for. And I said, all I need is a Band-Aid. For 2 hours we drove around Indianapolis, Indiana. I seen the zoo, I seen the waterworks plant, I seen everything in Indianapolis, Indiana, but we could not find an emergency place. We actually ended up at one hospital and walked into the hospital, said we needed some care for an emergency, and they said, do you have an appointment? If you don't have an appointment, you can't come in. Wait a minute, this is a hospital, an emergency center. I told the ladies, all I need is a Band-Aid. Guess what? After 2 hours driving around, we finally found an emergency clinic just a couple blocks from where we started off. They stayed in the waiting room while they took me back to fix my finger. Guess what the doctor did? He gave me crazy glue and a Band-Aid. I said, go out and tell the two ladies out front, all he needed was a Band-Aid. God works in mysterious ways. So, when the storms come in your life, or have been in your life, where is God to you? Where is He when that storm hits you? I want to take a look at the disciples this morning. If you would turn in your Bibles, we're going to look at the very first storm they went through. Into the book of Mark, chapter 4. Mark chapter 4, verses 35 through 41. We're going to look at the storm that the disciples went through. Mark chapter 4, verses 35 through 41. I think most of these scriptures are listed in your bulletin, so you can take them home and look at them later. As evening came, Jesus said to his disciples, let's cross over to the other side of the lake. So they took Jesus in the boat and started out, leaving the crowds behind, although other boats followed. But soon a fierce storm came up. High waves were breaking into the boat, and it began to fill with water. Jesus was sleeping in the back of the boat with his head on a cushion. The disciples woke him up, shouting, Teacher, don't you care that we're going to drown? When Jesus woke up, he rebuked the wind and said to the waves, Silence, be still. Suddenly the wind stopped, and there was a great calm. Then he asked them, Why are you afraid? Do you still have no faith? The disciples were absolutely terrified. Who is this man? They asked each other. Even the wind and the waves obey him. It's amazing how quickly we lose control in the storm. Whether it's a heart attack, cancer, flu, or that dreadful, dreadful thing that we encounter called income tax time with the Internal Revenue Service. It's worse than a plague. It gives us fear. It makes us tremble. It gives us heartache. Life is not always fair. When life is going our way, we think we're in control. It gives us a sense of calm and assurance, but when things begin to fail, we lose that. We work hard all of our lives to be in control. Do the things that help us, that we can control everything we do. But what can we do when controlling things really matters? You see, the storms teach us that we're not in control of life. We have no control over it. The disciples, to this point, had been observers. They were not participants. They were like the cheering section. They were like the innocent bystanders. They were not called upon to do anything. It's kind of like the chicken and the pig when it comes to breakfast. The chicken is involved. It's just supply a couple of eggs. But for the pig, it takes a commitment of life. It takes a dedication to walk into that. The disciples had listened to Christ. They'd watched him. They'd observed him. They'd seen what he did. They'd seen how others have reacted. There was no demand placed on them. But all that was about to change. It was going to change in their life. You see, Jesus doesn't allow them, and he does not allow us to be spectators. He demands that we make a decision about him. You're going to make a decision for him, or you're going to make a decision against him, or you're going to decide, I don't want to make a decision, therefore you have made a decision against him. It's a yea or a nay, as it says in the scriptures. It's not a, well, I'll do it later, or maybe. That storm hit with the disciples. They were not ready. And like going to school, when you went through lesson after lesson after lesson, and you learned things, what happened at the end of those lessons? You had an exam. Well, let's look at the exam for the disciples. Let's look at their exam. They had a test. They were going to just cross to the other side. Just go across the Sea of Galilee, and that sea is not that big. It's only a few miles long. What did Jesus intend for them to do when they got to the other side? He never told them. What does he intend for you? Have you ever asked? When Jesus leads you into the storm, we may find that we don't like the response we get. Even in the 23rd Psalm, it says, yea, though I walk through the valley of shadow of death, I will fear no evil. It doesn't say, well, we're going to stop in the valley of the shadow and we're going to bury you there. No, it says we're going to walk through it. We're going to walk through it together. We're going through while others are struggling. Because we're Christians, we're supposed to be immune to these things. We're supposed to be protected from the things of the world and from the hurt and the pain and the realities of life. That's what the disciples thought. They'd been observers. When they got in the boat, things were hunky-dory. They got in the boat, it was calm. There was no storm, there was sunshine, it was paradise. But then the storm hit. And that's why we respond with anger and resentment when the storms hit us, because we see Jesus asleep in the back of the boat. And we're angry that he doesn't care. Did you ever stop to think in those passages? The waves were crashing in the boat was sinking. He's sound asleep in the back of the boat on a cushion. These were not big boats high above the water. They're like little fishing skips. He had to be getting wet. He didn't have an air mattress, so he wasn't floating on the water. He had to be sitting in the water, getting wet. Do you even think he might have been awake? They thought he was asleep. You ever played possum? Maybe he was just playing possum with the disciples, seeing what they were going to do. What are you going to do when you really get in a trial and you need God? He's there. He's not asleep. But he's not answering your call the way you think he should. What happens? Our response is we usually try to control the storm. And while we are seeking to be in control, Jesus is still there with us. He is still in our boat. We don't want to bother him. We don't want to ask him. The disciples didn't want to wake him up. Boy, he'd been busy all day. But yet they were getting angry because he was not paying attention to what they needed. The storm continued. We reached that point of terror in our storm that it makes us angry with the Lord. But it wasn't because he wasn't there. It was because we didn't ask. It was because we didn't seek him. We didn't have the trust and the faith for his answer. He doesn't see things the way we do. He awoke and he rebuked the storm. And not only that, but he rebuked the followers. Not for the storm, but because they didn't have faith. But Lord, I'm in the boat. I'm in the boat with you. Man, I've been coming to church and Sunday school every week for weeks and weeks and years, and I've learned about you, and I've learned about your word, and I've learned about your works. But faith? Now you're going to meddling with me. Now you're pushing me. I still think life is up to me. I can handle life's storms. I've got the wisdom, I got the strength, I got the energy to be in control of life. And when it doesn't work, I get angry and mad. Don't we? And we blame God. It's God's fault the storm came. He made the storm. He made that problem in my life. I still think it's up to me. I know me in theory, but I don't know him. Today in your life, is Jesus the living truth? Or is he just a sleeping theory in your boat? Is he just sleeping theory in your boat? And you really don't know him. You know about him. Well, let's look at that test of the disciples. Turn to the second storm. John chapter 6. Book of John chapter 6, verse 15 through 19. We're going to look at another storm. And then we're going to go from John 6. If you had your finger there in Matthew, keep it on Matthew 14, 24 through 32, because we're going to look at both of these. John gives us a little insight into this second storm that Matthew doesn't. But this is the second storm. Not too many days after the first storm they'd been through. Therefore, when Jesus perceived that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, he departed again to the mountain by himself alone. Now when evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into the boat, and went over the sea toward Capernaum. They're going back across that sea again, approximately 10 miles. And it was already dark, and Jesus had not come to them. Then the sea arose because a great wind was blowing. So when they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, and now we'll go to Matthew 14, 24 through 32, and we'll finish that part of the story with Matthew's perspective. The disciples were in trouble far away from land. Remember, they were only 3 or 4 miles away from land on a 10-mile trip. For a strong wind had risen, and they were fighting heavy waves. About 3 o'clock in the morning, Jesus came towards them walking on the water. When the disciples saw him walking on the water, they were terrified. In their fear, they cried out, "It's a ghost." Let me stop right there and explain to you why they thought it was a ghost. See, these were fishermen. They believed that nothing good came out of the sea or land at night. At night, being out on the water was terrifying. There were monsters that lived under that water. There were ghosts in that water that would come up at night and take fishermen. And now they're on the water in the middle of a storm, and here they see a ghost. They knew their fears were coming true. Reading on with that story, but Jesus spoke to them at once. "Don't be afraid," he said. "Take courage, I am here." Then Peter called to him, "Lord, if that's really you, tell me to come to you walking on the water." "Yes, come," Jesus said. So Peter went over the side of the boat and walked on the water towards Jesus. But when he saw the strong wind and the waves, he was terrified and began to sink. "Save me, Lord," he shouted. Jesus immediately reached out and grabbed him. "You have so little faith," Jesus said. "Why did you doubt me?" When they climbed back in the boat, the wind stopped. You see, not too many days before that, they had not learned the lesson. They were in a storm, in a boat, sinking with Jesus, and he calmed the storm. And he told them the same words, "Oh, ye have little faith." And now they're back again. Well, the miracle here was not just in the storm being calmed. You see, there was several miracles here. Jesus walking on the water, we think of that. We think of Peter walking on the water until the wind slapped him in the face with the water, and he took his focus and his faith turned from Christ and he sank. But don't hold that against him. There was a whole boat full that didn't even step out of the boat. They could see Jesus. This was at 3 o'clock in the morning. It was dark. It was a storm. The sea was raging. The wind was at their back. It was pushing them back from the other side. Remember, they were rowing across to the other side 10 miles, and they'd only gone 3 miles, so the wind was facing them full on into their face. Christ was behind them coming from the land. How could they see him? That's a miracle in itself, that they could even see him. How could they hear him? The storm was blowing against him. You ever been out in a storm and a high wind when you tried to say something? Your voice doesn't travel through the wind. It travels with the wind. It's a miracle that they could hear him. They shouldn't have been able to. And that he turned fear into peace when they saw and heard him. Twice they'd been in the storm. Twice they'd been in the boat. Twice they had the same lesson. And still they feared. Still they had a lack of faith. How about our storm? A lady in Phoenix, Arizona, a young lady with a small child, a little 6-year-old boy by the name of Billy. Billy was dying of leukemia in a hospital. The mother so wanted little Billy to have a normal life and have all the things that a young child would have, but he was never going to. So she went to his room one night at the hospital and said, "Billy, what would you like to be if you were to grow up? What was it?" Little Billy answered and said, "Well, my dream was always to be, Mom, to be a fireman." She said, "Well, I'll see what I can do to make that dream come true." So she went down to the fire station and talked to the fire chief and asked him, said, "Well, maybe would it be possible," she told him the situation with little Billy, "would it be possible for maybe Billy to just come down here and take a ride around the block in a fire truck and just to see the fire station?" The chief said, "Well, ma'am, let's do this. At 7 o'clock on Wednesday morning, if you will get Billy up and get him dressed and bring him to the fire station, we'll make him an honorary fireman for the day. We'll get him a fireman's suit. Oh, not one of the little cheap plastic toy ones, you see. We will go to the manufacturer here in Phoenix that makes suits, and he will have a yellow slicker, and he will have boots, and he will have a fireman's hat with the emblem of the Phoenix Fire Department on it. It will be the official suit made specifically for him, and we will take him with us on everything we do that day. We'll honor him for the whole day. You just have him ready." Well, that morning they picked little Billy up, gave him his suit, put him in his clothes. He got to ride on the fire trucks to several calls that day. He got to ride with the paramedics. He got to ride in the fire chief's car. They made him an honorary member. They loved on him. Even the news media came out and filmed it. Because his dream was fulfilled, little Billy lived several months longer than what the doctors had expected he would live. But one night as he was slipping away, the nurse at the hospital was familiar with hospice. She thought nobody should die alone, especially a little child. So she began calling people, and she remembered the fire chief. She called the fire chief up and said, would it be possible for a fireman to come down and just say goodbye to little Billy? The fire chief said, yes, but we're going to do this. In just a matter of a few minutes, you will hear a fire truck coming in. When you hear the sirens blaring and the lights flashing, just get on the PA system and tell everybody that this is not a real fire. It's just some firemen coming to say goodbye to one of their favorite and best firemen to honor him. Oh, and by the way, open the window to Billy's room. In just a matter of a few minutes, the sirens came. A hook and ladder truck pulled up outside the hospital, raised the ladder up to Billy's third floor window. 16 firemen climbed in that window. They loved on him. They hugged him. They wished him farewell. That little boy turned to the fire chief and he said, Chief, am I really a fireman now? The chief looked at him and said, yes, Billy, you really are. But the head fire chief, Jesus, is holding your hand. Billy looked back at him and said, yes, sir, I know. He's been holding my hand all day. And the angels have been here singing. And with that, he closed his eyes. He slipped away. The faith of a mother, faith of a little boy in a storm of life that they were fighting desperately. He won. He won. May we have the faith to realize that God is holding our hand each and every day. Whether it's sunshine, whether it's storms, He is there. And He's saying to us, you're with me. You're with me. You're with me. When those storms hit you today and tomorrow and the days to come, remember, you're with Him. James 1:2-6 says, consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature, complete, not lacking anything. If any of you lacks wisdom, you should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to you. But when you ask, you must believe and not doubt, because the one who doubts is like the wave of the sea, blown and tossed by the wind. Have faith and believe that you are with Him. Even in the trials, even in those times when doubt should come, believe. Stop telling God how big your storm is and start telling the storm how big your God is. He is bigger than any storm that's ever going to come your way. Remember, you're with Him. God is here. He is involved in your lives. He's the creator of all. He created everything, and He created you. He's the Lord of all. He's the source of everything you have. And He loves you. He'll never forsake you. He is going to be with you always from now until eternity, if that's what you choose. Hell is still your choice, if that's what you want. And He won't stop you from that. He'll allow you that if that's your desire. But that is not His desire. His desire is to be with you. His desire is for you to have eternity in heaven and to be heirs of His kingdom. He is the sovereign God. He is the only true and living God. Satan is nothing but trouble. His destiny is also foreknown and planned. God is here. The only way to control the storms of life is to trust the only one who can control it. Have faith in Christ to take you across to the other side. You see, the disciples didn't know what they were going across to the other side for, and it really didn't matter. All they needed to do was have faith in Christ that says, we're going to the other side. Christ was the weatherman that says, hey, there's a storm coming. There is a storm coming. And I'm going to take you to the other side. They couldn't see it. He could, because He could control it. They couldn't. So why worry them by saying, I'm going to have you take a boat to the other side, and you're going to row right out into the middle of a severe storm at night in all your fears. They wouldn't even got in the boat. They just sat on the bank and said, no way, man. I ain't going out there. That's like me. Somebody says, you want to go on a cruise? No. That's too far to swim. There's big fish out there that are hungry. I'm not lunch. I'm going to go to Alaska and feed the bears. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. But Christ said, I am the bread of life. He who comes to me shall never hunger, and he who believes in me will never thirst. We're going to be partaking of communion in just a few minutes. We're not going to thirst. We're not going to hunger. We might now, but God's going to supply our needs. He's going to take care of us. If He could survive for 40 days in the wilderness with no food, maybe only water if He could even find that, we complain over a few days. We complain if we miss a meal. I don't. Well, unless it's late at night. I'm a nocturnal eater. I can go all day without eating. Doesn't bother me a bit. It's something I've gotten used to. When I was young, growing up on the farm, if it meant I could stay in bed 30 minutes and sleep in the morning or get up and eat breakfast, I'm staying in bed. Breakfast was not important. Breakfast was something you did about 10 o'clock, but by 10 o'clock I was busy and I couldn't come in and eat breakfast. I was out in the field. And noon was the same thing. It's just, I'm busy. It's just kind of a bother. You know, eating's bad for your health. It's habit forming. But God is in control. So when you hear them say through the storm of life, over the wind and the sea of strife, you'll hear Him speaking to you through that storm, peace be still. You're with me. You're in my boat. Peace be still. When we grasp that, we will grasp His excellence. And He will speak to us. And that Holy Spirit and all of its excellence will emerge in us any place we serve. I don't know what God is calling you to or calling you through. What storm? Maybe whatever He's calling you to, you're even afraid to get into the boat. Whether it's calling you to be a teacher, a discipler, a servant, maybe even a preacher. If I'd have known when I was a teenager or younger that I was going to be a preacher, I'd have said, God, ain't no way I'm getting in that boat. But he moved me mile by mile by mile by mile across that lake. And there are still storms I don't like. And there's still times when in those storms I get angry with God. But I learned a long time ago, if I'm angry with God, one of the things I need to do is I need to tell him about it. I need to tell him right then, hey, God, I'm mad at you. I don't like this. And he'll say, it's okay, I'm in your storm with you. I'm there with you. And at least, if you're mad at me, you're talking to me. Don't be like the disciples doing something else in the boat and not telling Jesus what the problem was. He knew. He wanted them to tell him, to depend on him. He was in the boat with them. He's in your boat. You might as well talk to him. And then he'll say, peace be still. You're with me.